All right, everybody. Well, welcome to our very first Date with History for the year 2022. We are so excited to have you join us this evening. And before we get started, as usual, I do want to go over one of the upcoming events that are going to be happening with us here at the First Division Museum and the museums here at Cantigny Park while we wait for the rest of our guests to log in. So first and foremost, the last reminder that our transcripts can be turned off by using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So this program this evening is just one of a month-long collaboration with our friends at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada. So if you are tuning into this program, I want to encourage you to tune into our sister program, Headlines from History. They are also going to be featuring a speaker from the Mob Museum this month. Now, this month's Headline from History presented by the Robert R. McCormick House is going to be on Thursday, February 24th at 7 p.m. online via Zoom. And they're going to be focusing on a really big moment in Chicago history, which is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I'm really excited for that one. Our colleague and friend Chris from the McCormick House is going to be presenting that one, so I will be tuning in as a guest, hopefully just like you. And you can register for that program by going to cantigny.org. Also coming up later this month, we have our Veteran Voices program that's going to be focusing on women in service. That program is going to be happening Thursday, February 17th, 7 p.m. online via Zoom. And in that program, we're going to be speaking to two veterans of the 1st Infantry Division, and they're going to be sharing their experiences during the 1990s, and particularly their service during Operation Desert Storm. Really excited. These are two amazing women. And have such fascinating stories. So I hope that you'll be able to join us as we hear a little bit about their service. And of course, last but certainly not least, have to update everybody on what is the next Date with History. Now, I think it's important, everybody, if you are a regular Date with History viewer, you know that the program is always the first Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. March, that is not the case. So please know that this is not a typo when you see it. The program for the March Date with History is going to be on Thursday, March 17th, and it's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, an hour earlier than we're used to. And that's because our speaker is tuning in with us all the way from London, England. So we don't want her to be presenting at the wee hours of the morning for us. So she's going to be we're going to start an hour early for her. So 6 p.m. Central Standard Time in March. So join us for that one. This is a story about a woman codebreaker during World War I and has a really amazing DuPage County where our museum is located. If you're not local, if you are local, you'll know, has a really cool DuPage County side of this story. Right a few miles away from Cantigny, history was being made. So I hope that you guys will tune in with us for that program as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, everybody. Because before we get started this evening, I do want to just give a really big special announcement. So for those of you who have been our dedicated followers of the Date with History program, you know that we've been hosting this program for some time. And 2022 marks the 15th anniversary year of the Date with History program, which is such a milestone for any museum program to last 15 years. We couldn't have done it without all of our dedicated viewers and followers who come to these presentations. So thank you for letting us continue to tell you these stories and share these stories for 15 years. How cool is that? If this is your first time joining us virtually, we are going to be following just a couple of house rules while you're joining us. Please know this is a virtual webinar. We cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question for us, you can go ahead and submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I see some of you have started using it already. I'll get to those. You can submit questions throughout the entirety of the presentation, and we'll be saving those questions for the last 15 minutes. So hold on to your horses. We will get to them. We often have a lot of questions, so if I don't get to your question this evening, I apologize, but we're going to get to as many as possible. Also, a good thing to remember, we have a lot of snow out there, so we're going to do our best. I don't anticipate any problems. We haven't had any problems in the past, but just in case, we want to thank you guys in advance should we have any technical issues or connection issues. we're working to solve those as fast as we can. I say that because we're not going to have it. So knock on wood, right, everybody? Last but certainly not least, I want to say a big hello and thank you to all of our Illinois State teachers. I know there's a lot of you out there tonight who are tuning in with us for our professional development program. If you are an Illinois State teacher or you know an Illinois State teacher, these programs count for 1.5 professional development credits for the state of Illinois. So please contact us. We would love to go ahead and get you signed up with that. All right, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and welcome our guest speaker for the evening. Her name is Miss Claire White. So Claire is the Director of Education at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada, which sounds so much warmer than Chicago, Illinois. She is responsible for the curation and creation of the Mob Museum's education and interpretive programming. And she regularly publishes articles in Nevada Magazine and N Magazine in Nantucket, and as well as posts for the Mob Museum's blog on topics of prohibition. And we are so excited to have her this evening. Claire, thanks so much for joining us and for kicking off this really cool month-long collaboration with Mob Museum. The floor is all yours. Again, everybody, if you have questions as Claire is going, drop them in the Q&A for me, and I'll get back to you, Claire, at the end of the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for welcoming me this evening. It's so exciting to be able to speak to all of you in Chicagoland, as well as whoever is joining us from across the country. I'm going to be sharing my screen here, so I just need to get that up for us. And hopefully we can all see that. Looks good on my end. Thank you again for joining me this evening. I am really excited and really honored to talk to you tonight about the ways in which World War I finally cemented the temperance movement into the Prohibition Amendment. And before we get into the meat of our topic this evening, I do want to take a moment just to share a little bit about the museum at which I work. This is the Mob Museum in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. Hopefully, some of you on this call have had the opportunity to visit us, but if you have not, we are located in the original federal courthouse and post office here in Las Vegas. And we are also known as the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement. Our mission is to advance the public understanding of organized crime on American society. And as a part of that mission, we spend an incredible amount of time talking about prohibition. Here are pictures of 3 of our exhibits that highlight elements of the Prohibition story. Prohibition is so important to us because it was the best thing that ever happened to organized crime. Small-time gangs, especially in Chicago, but truly across the United States, became well-oiled machines, and mobsters across the nation became millionaires during the 13 years of Prohibition. The goals of the 18th Amendment, which created prohibition, can easily be summed up as improving health, wealth, and public safety. But a major problem with prohibition was that it limited individual rights without creating an effective way of enforcing this limit. And most importantly, it was never technically illegal to drink. Prohibition simply banned the manufacture, sell, and transport of alcohol. So as long as a thirsty person could find someone willing to make and sell them the liquor they desired, they felt secure that they weren't really breaking the law, and the mob was more than willing to oblige. In order to really understand how the Prohibition Amendment came to be, and in turn how the mob came to monopolize on this opportunity, I want to return us to right before the amendment was ratified. In January of 1919, Albert von Tinsler and Edward Lanska published The Alcoholic Blues, a song describing the feelings of a World War I vet as he considers the newly ratified Prohibition Amendment, which had been ratified by the 36th state, which was the required number at the time, on January 16th. And I'm going to share a little bit of the song. Hopefully our audio is no problem here. So I'm going to share this for a moment.
indeed I do. But oh, that war has made me blue. I like fighting, that's my name, but fighting is the least about the fighting game. When Mr. Hoover said to cut my dinner down, I never even hesitate, I never frown. I cut my sugar, I cut my coal, but now they just eat in my hole. I've got the blues, I've got the blues, I've got the alcoholic blues. No more beer, my heart to cheer. Goodbye, whiskey, you used to make me frisky. So long, highball, so long, gin. Tell me when you're coming back again. Blues, I've got the blues, since they amputated my booze. Lordy, lordy, war is, well, you know I don't have to tell. Oh, I've got the alcoholic blues, some blues.
So I'm going to stop it there, but also draw your attention to one of the lines in the second verse, which you can in fact see on this sheet music here. In the second verse, the narrator laments, "I wouldn't mind to live forever in a trench if my daily thirst they only let me quench, but not with bevo, near beer, or ginger ale. I want the real stuff by the pail." And although this song is certainly overdramatic, it perfectly illustrates the wet reaction to prohibition, what those who did not want prohibition, and particularly the World War I soldiers who saw it as sort of a something that had happened when they were doing something more important, something that happened when they were not able to watch over the home front. And this song's connection to World War I think, really helps us transition into the topic at hand. World War I served as the final rallying cry for the temperance cause. It would be easy to see this as simply a coincidence of timing, but the war did in fact create conditions that greatly improved prohibition's likelihood of passage. Wartime rationing paved the way for federal prohibition, and anti-German sentiment swayed major swaths of the American public to consider banning saloons and breweries when just a few decades before they were really on the fence. In general, also, the global movement during and right after World War I towards this ideal of a fair, equitable, scientific world, which many people who really championed for entry into the war of the United States, these things are directly in line with the motivations that pushed forward the Prohibition Amendment. And we'll talk a little bit about this poster later, but it's definitely one of my favorites. Prohibition was more than 100 years in the making by the time the amendment is ratified. It began as the temperance movement in the 1800s, and early supporters really were just advocating this personal commitment to quit drinking. There's something to be said about the need for the early temperance movement. In 1830, figures indicate that the average American over the age of 15 consumed over 7 gallons of alcohol a year. And in the last 100 years, that number has dropped down to about 2 to 3 gallons per year. At times, it has been even lower than that. And so, if you really think about the volume of alcohol, there were legitimate reasons why people were concerned, especially as we start moving into a more industrial age. In 1934, a year after Prohibition was repealed, per capita consumption was under 1 gallon, and it's kind of been up and down ever since. Until very recently, sort of the established apex of heavy drinking post Prohibition have been the 1970s and 80s, although I've recently seen some studies that thanks to COVID, the 2020s might surpass the 1970s. So I don't I don't know what that means for future prohibition laws, but it's something to keep in mind for all of us. This is an example of one of those early temperance pledge cards. This idea that you make a personal pledge, but you don't necessarily advocate for government action. The earliest temperance advocates can best be described as really just seeking moderation, and they were driven primarily by medical science. Founding father and physician Benjamin Rush, who served as George Washington's Surgeon General during the Revolutionary War, was one of these men who sort of typified this worry about the consequences of America's fascination with alcohol. He wrote in 1785 about the need to limit the ardent spirits of whiskey and rum because of their association with addiction, liver problems, diabetes, gout, and mental illness. And if we are really thinking about this critically, to be making many of these connections by 1785 is remarkable and incredibly worth noting. A lot of Benjamin Rush's medical practices have been thoroughly abandoned in the last few centuries, but this is definitely an exception to that rule. Alcohol at the time, though, was still commonly prescribed as medication, and he didn't necessarily discourage the occasional or even the medicinal use of alcohol. He also never saw a problem with beer, wine, or cider, which is another thing that's going to come up and is going to sort of dramatically shift when we get to World War One, or at least right before World War One. By the 1820s, clergymen were also beginning to speak vocally about temperance, and one of the first comprehensive pro temperance publications was published by Lyman Beecher in 1828. Beecher was a Presbyterian minister. He was the co founder of the American Temperance Society, as well as the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame. And his American Temperance Society, founded in 1824, was among the very first national organizations committed to the cause of temperance. They organized speakers and conventions around the nation, but they were divided on how much drinking was too much. What did moderation actually mean? And they were also incredibly focused on the impact of alcohol on the soul and sort of the sin of the individual. Not necessarily that alcohol was a reflection of society at large, just that it was a reflection of the individual. By 1831, women are really sort of taking the temperance charge, and there are 20 women's organizations dedicated to temperance in the US by the 1830s. It was an appealing cause for women who tended to be more active in Protestant and evangelical faiths at the time, so they were often hearing these sermons in their home churches. And it was also appealing because of the way that drinking could sometimes directly and also circumstantially impact women's quality of life. Certainly, if women were drinking, they were not performing their motherly duties to their fullest extent. And if men were out drinking, they were not actively supporting their families. And connections between alcoholism and domestic abuse specifically became a common rallying cry for women's temperance organizations. And this connection to the well being of families is important because it does take on a little bit more of a determined tone during World War One. I know it seems like I'm going over quite a bit of things that happened, truly a century before World War One, but I think it's important to understand how World War One, in some cases, just shifts, some cases amplifies, and sometimes subverts these early applications of temperance. By the time this woman, Frances Willard, who was the second president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, um, sort of rose on the scene in the 1870s and 80s, temperance was now usually referred to as teetotalism. And by this point, it is all about T, capital T, total abstinence from alcohol. And again, this really is sort of this shift that we're seeing from the 1820s to the 1880s and is going to inform the progressive era and certainly then inform how Americans feel during World War One. Frances Willard was an incredibly effective advocate, but the challenge that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had is even though they had temperance in the name, they tried to do so much. They tried to take on suffrage, they tried to take on sort of early social work causes, they tried to take on things related to um, suff- suffrage. There was so much going on that it was hard for them as an organization to be entirely effective when it came to temperance. But the one exception is mandated temperance instruction in schools. In 1881, the WCTU begins lobbying for this, and by 1901, a federal law required what was called scientific temperance instruction to be taught in all state-run public schools, federal territorial-run schools, and military schools. These lessons were very similar to anti-drug programs that exist today, but the amount of misinformation that they perpetuated is truly unbelievable. Lessons stressed that a person could become an alcoholic after just one drink. They manipulated figures so that it appeared to children that pretty much anyone who drank in any form or fashion would die because of their alcohol consumption. And particularly in middle military schools, they also stressed an almost symbiotic relationship between alcohol and venereal disease. And on top of that, they perpetuated all of these racist stereotypes about, for instance, African Americans not being able to hold their liquor, certain ethnic groups in Southern Europe having sort of this aggressive need for alcohol. It was just all of these things that are in no way founded. And as the temperance movement waged on, advocates became extremist. One of those extremists was Kerry Nation, who was said to be this incredibly tall, sturdy woman. The story is that she was 6 feet tall. I'm always skeptical about like historical figures' heights. I always wonder, who was measuring them and under what circumstances. But she was certainly an imposing figure, and no less so because of the way that she self-proclaimed herself. This is a direct description she gave of herself: a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. Nation's first husband, who had served as a doctor in the Union Army, was an alcoholic, and they had a very rocky marriage. They separated, and her second husband and her settled in Medicine Lodge, Kansas, in 1889, where she got very involved in the local WCTU chapter. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, my goodness. Um, Kansas at the time was already a dry state, but the law was rarely enforced. And Nation believed that they really need to do something about that. And so she prayed on it. She talked a lot about it in her local chapter. And in June of 1900, she had a dream that God came to her and suggested that she smash saloons. And that's exactly what she did. For the next 10 years, she would go all across Kansas with hatchets and hammers and rocks and attack both bars and pharmacies selling medicinal alcohol. She was arrested 30 times. She referred to these attacks as hatchetations, which is just about the most colorful and I guess heroic way you can describe the destruction of private property. But she felt so strongly about this, and in a lot of ways, it's unfortunate that Carrie Nation passed away in 1911. She missed both World War One and the passage of Prohibition. Um, So, as the 20th century began, a final shift occurs in the temperance movement when groups began applying more political pressure and urging for state and federal legislation that would prohibit alcohol. As this shift towards legal action began, women who still didn't have the right to vote in most states, and certainly not in federal elections at that point, they become less central to the movement. And what does become most important is the work of the Antisaloon League, which was founded in 1893 by a former lawyer and a congregational reverend in Ohio. Prior to Prohibition, it was considered the most powerful lobby in Washington. And it really is sort of the beginning of lobbying and pressure politics used to tackle a single issue in Washington. The League's initial goal was to pass a law in every state banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol. And they actively lobbied individual candidates who did not support such legislation to either sway them, and if they couldn't sway them, they did everything in their power to get them out. And they could not have done this without this man, Wayne B. Wheeler. who joined the League as one of its first full-time employees. He was an attorney and became really the public face of the Antisaloon League. And this quote comes from a speech he gave after the Anti-Saloon League successfully lobbied and ousted Ohio Governor Myron Herrick in 1906 due to his unfavorable stance on a statewide prohibition. As the Anti-Saloon League gained traction, temperance reformers began to be known as prohibitionists, urging for a national prohibition on alcohol sale and manufacture. And prohibitionists argued that people who supported the right to drink were un-American and opposed to progress. The Anti-Saloon League used the same emotional and religious tactics that had been used by their predecessors, but they coupled this with an aggressive political strategy, and they weren't afraid to appeal to individuals in all parties. By the 1900s, many progressives supported prohibition as a measure that could improve the country's health, increase individual wealth, and diminish violence, particularly domestic violence. Progressivism was all about the use of political reform and government action to eliminate problems that were caused by modern society, by industrialization and immigration and urbanization and modernization and political corruption and corruption in general. And for many, prohibition was just the type of action that could accomplish these goals. So what we see right at the sort of right at the tail end of the progressive era and the beginning of World War One is that this is no longer sort of motivated by strictly, men of faith or men of science. This is everyone. It doesn't matter if you're conservative, if you're progressive. This is something that is reaching that is helping people reach across the aisle. And by the time World War One began in Europe, and certainly when the United States entered the war, prohibition was already powerful, and the contributing factors certainly were varied and numerous. But what the war did was shifted sentiment in a way that cannot be understated. Although national politicians have a remarkable amount of power and latitude to create laws, a much larger swath of the American public must be engaged to pass an amendment because you need the two-third majority of states to independently ratify all new amendments, which means regardless of how each state handles ratification, which can vary both in time as well as individually from state to state, it does in fact vary. Regardless of that, you have to get more people on board. It is not the same as US senators just sitting there and saying, "Oh, I think this is what my constituents want," which I think is what we often get. But with an amendment, certainly the reason why it's so challenging to add these amendments is because of how many more people wind up being involved in this process. So this temperance postcard predates World War One, and it's important to note that because the connection between patriotism and prohibition was already well established before the war. But what the war did do is increased patriotism among the average American to a point where messages such as this had the intended effect on a larger swath of the nation's citizens. World War One, we don't talk about that patriotism with World War One the way we sometimes talk about it with World War Two, but it's something to keep in mind that this was something that really forms a new patriotic spirit, and certainly for more recent immigrants or for those who felt just a little disengaged from the idea of temperance. So, on May 18th, 1917, the United States enacts the Selective Service Act of 1917, sometimes referred to as the Selective Draft. It reworked the draft that had been on President Wilson's mind since late 1916. Even before we entered the war, Wilson was very concerned about what we would do with a selective draft if we did enter the war. And after the country entered World War One in April, this was an incredibly necessary step. So the act was canceled at the end of the war. Its period of enforcement was less than 2 years. but it's the first important milestone in the relationship between World War I and Prohibition. And I'm not going to outline the whole act, but it had a few important things to say about liquor. So, first of all, it prohibited intoxicating beverages in or near military camps, and it forbade the sale of liquor to servicemen in uniform, which was in and of itself essentially already in effect. This was just an extension of the pre existing Canteen Act, but certainly it is notable that with the changes that they were making, they not only keep this, but in fact, they strengthen it. In order to enforce these elements of the act, the War Department creates a 5-mile dry perimeter around military camps. And what is worth noting with that dry perimeter is it doesn't wind up being quite as dry as the 13 years of Prohibition. The Army continued to allow beverages with less than 1.4% ABV to be sold to servicemen, but 1.4% ABV is nothing. It's hardly anything at all. So certainly in effect, this creates a bone dry armed forces. And not only did most of the Allied powers and most of the countries active in World War I also sort of establish these similar wartime measures for their soldiers, but they also a lot of times establish similar wartime measures just across the board. So Russia passed a law in 1914 prohibiting the manufacture and sale of vodka for the duration of the war. In 1915, Great Britain passed a no treating order, which stipulated that no one may pay for or treat another person's bar tab. They also increased taxes on liquor and limited the hours in which bars could operate. And Sweden, when they established their rationing system in 1917, it effectively rationed not only alcohol, but also fermented beverage and liquor beverage ingredients. Now, certainly what's happening in Russia or Britain or Sweden or France, it doesn't necessarily translate to what is going to happen in America or in any other nation. But the reason why this is worth noting during World War One is for many people in the United States, the rhetoric as far as why we should enter the war was really centered around this idea that, like, we're going to go in there, we're going to clean this up, it's going to be the war to end all wars. All of that sort of rhetoric really speaks to the fact that, wow, if Russia can ban vodka, but we're over here like, I don't know, maybe we still need whiskey, maybe we still need moonshine. This has an effect on the American public and sort of the language used to talk about temperance. And the other thing that, truly I think it's hard sometimes to remember and to communicate this. On the eve of World War One, we still have so many first and second generation European Americans in the United States. We have so many people who have just very recently immigrated from Russia or Sweden or Britain or Germany or Belgium. And regardless of how committed they were and how happy they were to be Americans, they're certainly still having those emotional and political ties in some ways to their home countries. And so seeing that their home countries are making similar restrictions is in fact important to the rhetoric of some particular areas of the country. Political cartoons and posters immediately seize on this combination of military and dry imagery to sort of connect prohibition with wartime patriotism. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union style of sort of scientific temperance was also reapplied to new metrics, including soldiers' efficacy and skill. Seen here is a study about marksmen and their impaired skill after drinking the equivalent of 2 pints of beer. This was published by the American Issue Publishing Company, which is the publishing arm of the Antisaloon League. And you can see it's copyrighted also by the Scientific Temperance Federation. So there you go, right there in the name. They're the Scientific Temperance Organization. Throughout the war, organizations such as the Anti-Saloon League and the Ohio Dry Federation, who put this out, double down on how backing booze is antithetical to patriotism and support for our troops. And very much in line with these wartime measures are the push towards using grains as food rather than as raw ingredients for booze. And certainly throughout the 20th century and also back in time even further, there's always going to be some sort of wartime measure towards conservation and increased food production and all of that. But specifically in World War One, before the United States entered the war, they really saw it as their duty as well as the duty of Canada to sort of increase food production in order to aid Europe. And this push towards using grains as food rather than as raw ingredients for booze is arguably a lot more practical argument for prohibition on the home front. I mean, certainly there's a lot to be said for these patriotic images of soldiers and staying dry. But if soldiers are on the front lines, I think there's certainly that argument of like, well, why is the home front dry? We don't need that. Across the Western world, countries established measures meant to ensure soldiers received proper rations. And in March 1917, the United States National War Garden Commission was established to assist Americans with the cultivation of small war gardens. And then in August of that year, the Food and Fuel Control Act outlawed the use of any grains or foodstuffs for producing distilled spirits. This emergency wartime measure was set to automatically expire at the end of World War I, but it's one of many measures that prepare the American public for an eventual ban on liquor. And propaganda really demonizes the production of liquor and beer during Prohibition. It often is focused specifically on the perceived waste of brewers and distillers. And I will say brewers are a much more common feature, and we'll we'll get into that in a moment. But this poster, created by the United Committee on War Temperance Activities in the Army and Navy, it was published in 1917. This is really just the most succinct summation of the sentiment on uh, how sort of alcohol just didn't fit with wartime conservation efforts. And the organization that established this, the United Committee on War Temperance Activities, was an extension of the Joint Executive Committee of the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America, but they wind up sort of supervising the working arrangements and temperance activities for the Army and Navy when it comes sort of to wartime prohibition, which I think is an interesting thing to note. This pamphlet, produced by the Antisaloon League's publishing arm, American Issue Publishing Company again, uses a combination of essentially manipulated figures and sentimental language to highlight the way grains are wasted to produce intoxicants. I'm not going to deny that bread is more important than booze during war. That's clearly not my stance, but the numbers that they use are just not in line with what we're actually seeing as far as consumption in the United States. Number 5 here says that if we stop allowing brewing and distilling, that it would release for human food about 85 million bushels of grain and about 115 million pounds of sugars and syrups, and that barley alone could produce the normal bread rations for 8.6 million people. And again, it's not that these things aren't necessary. It's just that the numbers are, in a lot of cases, just these fabricated numbers. And the relationship between grain and beer brings us really to our final turning point, which is anti-German sentiment. In the 1910 US Census, more than 9 million respondents spoke German as their first language. This is 10% of the national population. And this is because Germans were the largest immigrant group into the United States for a large portion of the 19th century. For the first few years of World War I, support for Germany in the United States was sort of tacitly tolerated, even though the government's position certainly was neutral. This was often challenging to maintain because for every German American who either supported or tolerated or was neutral to their former countrymen, there were these horrific stories of German brutality that was being reported in the United States. You know, things we were hearing from Europe as well as US citizens coming back from, specifically Belgium and saying, this is what's happening. This is horrible. This is unprecedented. It's well beyond the pale of sort of a standard war. And I, there had already been in Europe this mounting anti-German sentiment as soon as the German unification in 1877. So within the first few months of the war, these reports of German atrocities really affect the tone of wartime propaganda. And of course, at first, this is all happening in Britain, this is all happening across Europe. But it doesn't take long for this tone to affect propaganda in the United States. By 1917, it became publicly unacceptable to support the German cause. Anti-German sentiment grew so strong that sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. German music and books were banned in public festivals, certainly not unanimously, but across large portions of the United States. And between 1917 and the 1920s, so this continues on after World War I is over, 14 states ban the German language in schools. You can't instruct either, you can't teach German at all as a foreign language, nor can you instruct as in German as a first language. And even Dachshunds weren't spared. There are numerous newspapers that tell stories of Dachshunds being shot or stoned to death. I will say, and certainly I'm sure there are a lot of a lot of amazing World War One buffs on this video who are gonna come at me and say none of that's been proven. And you are correct. It's very hard to find concrete proof, but there is certainly stories of it. And even if it didn't happen, we do know that that's when we start calling them wiener dogs in the United States to get away from the German name. After the United States formally entered the war, the government uses this sentiment to recruit soldiers. And on the left-hand side, we see in particular a American bulldog chasing after a German Dachshund. And this was really a play on what many German soldiers were calling American Marines, which is Teufelhunden. And I know I'm mispronouncing that because German is neither my first, second, or any language, but it translates to devil dog, and that's really how U.S. Marines sort of co-opt that nickname of devil dog. Besides the Dachshunds, besides the sauerkraut, besides the German language, beer essentially becomes unpatriotic because in the United States, beer means Germans. By the 1900s, beer sold in the United States was almost exclusively American style lagers, which were the nearly exclusive output of large German American run breweries. Before large waves of German immigrants began settling in the United States in the 1840s, Americans drank ale, and the first wave of English settlers brought this ale to the New World. The style ferments at warmer temperatures, and it's very good for filling you up and warming you up if you're in New England or Chicago. But they don't stand up well to long-term storage or transport, and that really led to their demise because it's a lot easier to transport an ale from one side of, England to the other than it is across the vast American continent. So by the middle of the 19th century, German Americans began establishing breweries across the Northeast and Midwest. And Americans of all ethnicities and nationalities fall hard for this clean, smooth drinking lager and pilsner that they're producing. Lagers tasted fresher, they traveled more easily, and they looked more effervescent in a glass than the Old English ales. And the success of German American brewers, such as Joseph Schlitz, Frederick Pabst, Frederick Miller, and Adolphus Busch, had a number of consequences. These lagers became the perceived standard of quality and taste. They continually reinvested in more technologically advanced machinery and were able to negotiate lucrative deals for raw materials and distribution. And at a time of anti-German sentiment, their industry was a clear target. Americans already linked breweries to German Americans, as this temperance postcard from 1909 graphically illustrates. What changes during the war was what fraction of the American public was swayed by this anti-immigrant xenophobic rhetoric targeted specifically at Germans. World War I provided the emotional landscape to turn America against their ethnically German countrymen. A dry Wisconsin politician best summarized the shift with this quote: "We have German enemies across the water, and we have German enemies in this country too. The worst of all our German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller." By the time America entered World War I, 21 states were at least partially dry. But the federal government did not have the support in urban areas, in certain strongholds, certainly in areas that were largely German or largely Irish. In 1914, the Hobson Resolution, which essentially with a few modifications did in fact become the 18th Amendment in 1920, it fails to receive two-third majority of votes in the House of Representatives. But by December of 1917, Congress's opinion of temperance had changed, and the proposal for the 18th Amendment was submitted to the states on December 22nd. With the onslaught of new rhetoric related to the ills of alcohol and the threat of German American brewers, in January 1919, ratification by two-thirds of the 48 states was complete. One significant note about the 18th Amendment and its companion enforcement law, the Volstead Act, is how intoxicating beverages were defined. Volstead established the definition of intoxicating beverages as any that contain more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, and this was directly aimed at brewers. Earlier iterations of the temperance and prohibition movements often aimed to target simply hard spirits, not necessarily fermented beverages such as wine and beer. And many states, as well as early limited federal liquor bans, such as the Canteen Act, usually stopped at anywhere from 4% to 2.75%, or at most 1.4% alcohol by volume. By defining intoxicants as beverages above 0.5% ABV, the Volstead Act hit breweries fully and completely. And with that, I want to thank you, and I am happy to answer all the questions that come up.
Well, I know, Claire, everybody, we cannot hear or see you. So on behalf of everybody who's watching, I just want to give you a round of applause and thank you for sharing what is a real, I mean, we are a military museum. We focus so much on soldiers and battle, but what an interesting way to kick off our 15th anniversary year with such a unique topic. And I want to thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I know I learned a lot and enjoyed that song particularly. I want to listen to the whole song now.
It's great. It's so much fun. I love that song. In fact, I love temperance propaganda music. It's wonderful. Both
I have
sides.
not
I
dug
like it
into
all.
that. For propaganda music, absolutely. So I'm excited to dig a little more into that. We do have some questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and just get us started right away. Okay, Claire?
Yes.
So this question refers back to earlier in your presentation. So our guest wanted to know a little bit about wasn't a contributor, pardon me, to the high consumption of alcohol due to the impurity in drinking water. And they had read somewhere that it was common for children to drink beer and wine simply because the water just wasn't clean.
So yes, and in fact, if you want to have me back, I'll tell you all about high alcohol consumption and the legitimate reasons for it. You are certainly correct, and I really did gloss over that. There are two very strong reasons why people in the 17 and 1800s were still drinking so heavily, and the first is most certainly about the impurity of drinking water. For many, having a stable fermented beverage source was easier than ensuring that you could boil water every time you needed to drink it,
Mm-hmm.
and then put it somewhere. The other major contributing factor is actually just an excess of grains, particularly as we started to move west. And I mean, that's certainly very relevant in Chicago. But as the nation started to move into Illinois and Indiana and Kentucky and Tennessee, there were all of these farmers producing an excess of grain, and it would go bad by the time it made its way to Eastern
Hmm.
markets. But if they turned it into alcohol instead, they could get it all the way to Boston or Savannah, no problem.
So this guest had a question about opposition to the 18th Amendment. Given given the substantial alcoholic beverage market both before and during Prohibition, what was the organized opposition to the 18th Amendment and the campaign followed during the 1920 ultimately to overturn it with FDR's election?
So, as far as the organized opposition against the 18th Amendment before passage, it essentially falls into one of two categories. The first category is just that it wasn't well organized, that there were a lot of people who I truly believed it couldn't pass. I mean, it's truly is a great lesson in, like standing up for your rights and standing up for what you believe in. Because I think sometimes in the United States we
Mhm.
think we're always going to have all of the freedoms we currently have, and we don't need to do anything to safeguard them. And I think regardless of where you fall on the aisle, that's something that unfortunately a lot of times we have we have that mindset, and it's because we do live such free lives in the United States. But part of the problem was that it wasn't well organized. The true exception to that is German American brewers, which only wound up making it worse in the long run. The one very strong anti-prohibition lobbying group in Washington was funded almost entirely by German American social groups and German American brewers, like their professional organization. And so at first, it was okay. It was enough to lobby against it, but because of the shift during World War One, it again wound up sort of being the worst possible anti-prohibition lobbying group. As far as what does turn the tide after prohibition and lead to repeal,
Mhm.
what to me is just wild is that essentially they just take all the same arguments they took pro prohibition and they turn them on their head. So a very well known repeal group was the women's, oh my gosh, I'm not going to say their name right. Women's Organization for National Prohibition Repeal, I believe is what it was. And they took all of the posters that the WCTU and the Antisaloon League had produced saying, like, do this for the boys and girls, do this for the soldiers, who do you care more about, the kids or the brewers, things like that. And they just flipped it on their head and said, I want repeal for my child. I don't want there to be, what do you want to give money to the mob or do you want to give money to my son? And the other major thing that shifted it was an increase in violence.
Mm.
Mob violence becomes a very unpalatable social issue across huge portions of the United States during Prohibition, and that really does shift people's mind. They wanted a healthier, wealthier, and safer world, and the only person who got wealthier was mobsters. And on top of that, we suddenly had a massively an increased homicide rate.
Right. And if you want to learn more about that, I highly suggest tuning in to our February 24th headline from history. I feel like that presentation is going to pick up right where we're leaving off on these after effects. And of course, that one's going to focus on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But be sure to join us February 24th as we
Yes,
learn more from our friends at the Mob Museum. This guest
yes.
just wants to throw out a really great and interesting fact that we didn't get to touch on, but is just so interesting. This guest mentions that the U.S. Navy banned alcohol on ships and Navy bases in 1914. So even on ships and Navy bases too. That was during with General Order 99. Thanks so much for sharing that fact with us.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I was worried. I didn't know if I should talk too much about the Navy or the Marines. I didn't want to.
We love and welcome and thank all of our service branches for their service. So we are supportive of all of our service branches.
Wonderful. I shouldn't have thought otherwise, of course.
Can you take a second to discuss the change in perspective from the first progressive voices that were against distilled alcohol to the Antisaloon League's subliminal anti-labor messaging that specifically targeted the Irish and German labor agitation?
Yeah, so that is a great question, but I think it's a challenging question to answer very succinctly
Mm-hmm.
because the so the way the way I'm gonna, I think, summarize it is that the Anti-Saloon League would, even though they were a single issue lobbying organization, they would make any connections that they could to sort of push forward a point, and they were not afraid to take exactly oppositional stances in order to draw people towards the temperance cause. So, I mean, there's letters written and correspondence between them and the Wobblies. There's correspondence between them and, the most conservative sort of Presbyterian organizations. And there's a lot more to that story. I think it's a great question, but I think it is a tough one to summarize.
I think it's a good segue. We've had a lot of guests who are asking questions about religion and prohibition. So I'm going to try and get everybody's question into this one right here. But some guests were asking, like, what were church influences over all of this? Some of them are asking questions about, they're assuming that Protestants, with the exception of Lutherans, being very supportive of prohibition, while Catholics maybe being opposed to it, and how those specific religious sects were breaking out and what they were feeling.
Yes. Short answer is that is exactly correct. Catholics and Jews, pretty much, with a few exceptions, generally were not big supporters of prohibition.
Mm.
And you are certainly correct that Lutherans also tended to subscribe much less frequently to the temperance movement or to the prohibition cause. It started as very much the early evangelical religions that you would expect. So it starts out as the Baptists and the Methodists and certain individual sects of Presbyterians in the United States. But by the 1900s, it becomes there's a massive shift, and you get to a point where essentially, other than Catholics and Jews, it's crossing all Christian
Hmm.
sectarian boundaries, and part of that is just the effectiveness of the lobbying. The other thing that I think is always this kind of a fun fact related, that doesn't really answer the question, but a fun fact. Welch's grape juice and a number of other sort of grape cocktail products start out specifically being promoted as a sacramental alternative to wine. So even
Didn't know
among
that.
even among some of the congregations that you might think were like never going to give up their wine, even some of them switched over to grape juice at the eve of Prohibition.
And speaking of grape juice, one of our guests had a question about like substituting like liquor and beer with like a hard cider, and if there was any like connections there with hard cider drinkers.
Yeah, so hard cider was definitely popular in the 1800s as well as the
Okay.
1700s. By the 1900s, it really does sort of cease to be as large of a presence in the United States. But that's definitely a part of the story. And certainly all of those fermented beverages, all of those not
Mm-hmm.
not hard liquors, were a part of the daily American diet. And, as someone pointed out, even for young kids, I mean, you weren't getting a full on, 5, 6% cider or beer when you were 8, but you were certainly getting watered down cider or beer instead of impure water.
Well, I do want to honor our end time. So if everybody will hang in there with me, I'm gonna try and get in two more questions. I know we have a lot of questions that were asked. I'm gonna try and get in at least two more. Um, So kind of piggybacking what you're talking about right now, one of our guests wanted to know if excessive drinking by Civil War veterans after the American Civil War had any play in like the promotion of the Prohibition movement during the 1800s.
That's a great question, and it's also a very astute observation.
Yeah.
Men coming home from the Civil War having picked up a habit of alcoholism, either because it's something they picked up in the war or because they were suffering from, undiagnosed PTSD, definitely affected the amount of women specifically who actively sort of uh, worked towards temperance. Yes.
And oh, we're okay. We're gonna get into more. I swear. Thank you everybody for hanging in there with me. We're trying to get to as many. And I've had a couple of guests ask a question about a story that I'm not familiar with, and they wanted to know a little bit more about the story of Calvin Coolidge, and denaturing alcohol with methyl alcohol. Have you heard this story?
Um, I do not know specifically about Calvin Coolidge and methyl alcohol. I do know that the Volstead Act established three loopholes during Prohibition, which allowed for medicinal, sacramental, and scientific slash industrial alcohol.
Okay.
And so one of the easy loopholes was to continue drinking by getting a medicinal liquor prescription every 10 days. And that's right, I did in fact say every 10 days. Or pretending you were a rabbi or a priest, getting fraudulent papers, or finally using wood alcohol, ethyl alcohol, methyl alcohol, which essentially is all poison if you're drinking too much of it or you're not
Hmm.
watering it down. But a lot there was that was. Prohibition is so interesting because the health impact of it is very fractured. Alcohol related deaths did go down significantly, but the deaths that did occur were almost entirely avoidable by just letting people drink a little bit of beer or wine if they wanted.
Right. All right. So this is going to be our last question for the evening. Before I do want to send it back over to our teachers and let you talk to them for a second. But I think this is a good question to end on because it kind of ties us back to Chicago and maybe sets us up for our next presentation. So Chicago had a number of German clubs, social clubs. Were those established so that beer could be drunk privately?
So a lot of those, and I'm sure so many of you on this Zoom would know better than I, but I imagine most of those German clubs actually predate Prohibition. They probably did begin as perfectly just normal social clubs. But yes, very much so. When we're looking during the Prohibition period, private social clubs, not just among German Americans, but Italian Americans, Irish Americans, British Americans, African Americans, if you're seeing private social clubs in the 1920s, they were almost they're almost always an opportunity to drink beer. And that's what's so tough about Prohibition. And I know Jeff will I certainly don't know exactly what he'll talk about, but I know he'll talk about this. That was what was so tough about enforcing Prohibition. You tell people you can't make, sell, or transport alcohol, but you can technically still drink it medicinally and you can technically still homebrew it at home. There was no rule against homebrewing. You just needed the supplies to do it. And so if you're already, a German guy who already knew how to brew beer, you're already set. Of course, you're going to keep doing it in the privacy of your home or club, regardless of what the law says.
Well, Claire, before we send everybody out for this evening, I know we have a substantial amount of Illinois State teachers tuning in this evening to learn more so they can bring some of these amazing stories to their vast knowledge. Do you have any resources from the Mob Museum online that our teachers can access?
Yes, so we would love for you to visit us at themobmuseum.org. We have a couple different things, so I'm just going to really quickly go through some of the things we have on our website. We have worksheets, primary source readers, writing prompts. The screenshot here just shows our high school and some of our middle school materials, but we have them for all ages. Some are Prohibition and American history related, some are forensic science, some are Las Vegas history. We also have two what we call our microsites, which are wonderful resources not just for teachers, but also can be used in the classroom as a web quest, or if you have students working on things like National History Day projects. You can access both of these microsites. One is on Prohibition and the other is on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre using our website. In the top sort of navigation bar, if you hit Explore, you can access both of those websites. You'll access the majority of this, though, through our Community and Education tab, which is also found under Explore. Investigating History is our educational outreach program. Um, of course, we can't visit you in person all the way in Chicago, unfortunately, but we do offer virtual classroom visits. We didn't do it before COVID, but been doing it now for 2 years, and it's a well-oiled machine. We visited schools in New York and Pennsylvania and Indiana, and we'd absolutely love to add Illinois to that list. And then I think this is the final thing. I might have another thing after this. We'll see. I also encourage you to check out our YouTube. We do have live stream videos of the vast majority of our public programs. We also have some short videos on certain historical topics. And then we have a virtual guided tour of the museum featuring me. So if you didn't get enough of me tonight, I don't know if that's possible. But if you didn't, you can check out our virtual tour. And that's it. That's what I had.
Well, thanks so much, Claire. And again, some of the wonderful things about being virtual, especially for our teachers, is that we don't need to be in Las Vegas to go on a field trip. You guys can come right there. So, Claire, thank you so much for kicking off our 15th anniversary year of State with History off so well. I want to say a special thank you to everybody who tuned in. I hope you join us on February 24th as we continue our series with the Mob Museum. Again, you can sign up for that on cantini.org. And right after this, the screen should take you straight to the next Date with History presentation in March. So you can go ahead and sign up, and we will see you again in March. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Claire. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.